I'm the deputy lead for the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee in Sportex. I'm really honored to chair this webinar on challenging microaggressions during this Black History Month. The main reason okay, I will. I just had a notice pop up, so yeah. A key purpose of our EDI committee across the university is to develop, coordinate, and monitor actions that are taken by all the schools. We are here as a EDI committee to address the Race Equality Charter, and our focus is to, we need to focus on racial issues and we need to eliminate discrimination. That's one of the main purposes of the EDI committee, in addition to all the other aspects of gender discrimination and all that. But working on this key agenda, it involves bringing together people who are motivated to influence change. People like you. We need to create awareness. And that's why we are here today, this evening in this Black History Month. We are here to create awareness regarding a subtle form of racism, which is microaggressions. Even though microaggressions are subtle, the psychological, social, and physical consequences in the modern society, they're very damaging. They're as damaging as overt racism. Historically, overt racism has been the obvious social evil. But since the 70s, when the term microaggression was coined, this discriminatory and racist phenomenon has gained traction, especially with the younger generation. They highlight this aspect of racism much more than the older generation. So as you can see, a lot of our panel members are quite young and they're very passionate about challenging microaggression. Basically, I just want to let you all know that this session is being recorded. I just want to remind you that we're not here to point fingers. We're not here to feel guilt or shame, but to share. We are here to understand and make changes so that we can move forward. Our panel of passionate and inspirational speakers will present their different perspectives on what is microaggression, the prevalence and consequences of microaggression in different sectors, and they will share personal and vicarious experiences of microaggression. Most importantly, the aim of the session is our speakers will give us some insights into how to feel and act when faced with similar situations in the future, so that we can challenge and abolish microaggressions in the real world. So basically, if anybody has questions from the audience, please type it into the Q&A. We might not be able to answer all the questions, but we will pick and choose as many questions as possible. We already have a list of questions from the registrants, so we'll try and take as many questions as possible. Other than that, I think we're ready to go. And I'm really honored to introduce the first speaker of this evening, Carlette. So Carlette Norwood. Carlette Norwood, welcome Carlette, and thank you so much for being one of our panelists today. Carlette is a third-year postgraduate researcher at the University of Birmingham in the Department of Sociology and Social Care. She's from Washington, D.C., USA. She completed a dual honors degree in psychology and sociology, followed by a Master of Science in Administration and Organizational Development. She's an author, she's an entrepreneur, she's a graphic designer for websites and books. I can go on and on and on about Carlette. But prior to relocating to England, she worked as an adjunct professor of both sociology and psychology at the College of Southern Maryland for 7 years. So she has a teaching background as well. Her current research is focused on institutional racism, including microaggressions in higher education, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about that. She is also researched in post-traumatic stress disorders in the Black people. And for that part of her research, she has worked with Black communities that were affected by Hurricane Katrina. Currently, her PhD is about the psychological, emotional, and physical impact of racism among Black American women and Black British women. She's going to share her knowledge and research knowledge about microaggressions. Thank you, Carlette.
Thank you, Sheeba, for a great introduction. And thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to be a part of this very, very important panel. I'm going to give a brief talk about microaggression, but primarily focus on what I think is the most damaging aspect of microaggression, which is micro invalidation. And I lost my, hold on just a second. Okay, here we go. Okay, micro invalidations are the most prevalent and most damaging form of microaggressions. Microaggressions are negatively associated with various aspects of psychological health, which can affect physical health as well. Studies show that negative experiences of racism can impact health in the form of comorbid and chronic health disparities such as high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, low birth weight, depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, suicidality, frustration, and feelings of helplessness. Microaggression can also cause racial trauma and PTSD. Studies show that Black people and other ethnic minorities believe that racism is an ongoing and persistent problem that impacts every aspect of their lives, whereas most white people believe that racism is an experience of the past or that race relations are consistently getting better. In fact, research indicates that racism and racist activity toward ethnic minorities has increased, not decreased, between 2010 and 2016. And so have the subtleties in which racism is imposed or inflicted. In other words, people have gotten smarter and more covert in their racist language and action. Lawrence Davies of Equal Justice says that 25% of white people in Britain admit to being either very or a little racist. Reports show that there are 1 million incidents of racism every year in the workplace. That equals 8 incidents of racism at work every working minute. Davies also says that 37% of BAME workers report incidents of racism on the job since the Brexit campaign, yet only 1% report it. According to Sue et al., there are 3 forms of microaggressions. Micro assaults, which are very overt forms of racism, such as racial epithets, hate crimes, etc. Micro insults, which are insulting to races in general. For example, to encounter an Asian person and say, "Oh, you must be really good in maths," and things like that. And micro invalidations, which invalidate the experience, the lived experiences of people of color. Micro invalidations are perhaps the most detrimental form of racism because of the psychological damage caused by constant questioning and doubting of our reality. It is a form of gaslighting that causes stress and anxiety and can complicate or impair interpersonal relationships, including familial relationships and employment. Micro invalidations are unconscious communications that negate the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of people of color and women. Additionally, comments such as "I'm colorblind," or "I can't be racist because I have Black friends," "I don't see race," "You're just being overly sensitive," or "So-and-so's not racist, they're just being a jerk," or a retort that "all lives matter," are all examples of micro-invalidation. These comments come from individuals who have never experienced racism, yet feel uniquely qualified to voice an opinion, thereby nullifying or diminishing lived experiences of people of color. These statements only serve to reinforce dominance, privilege, and power to impose a false reality upon marginalized populations. Terminology such as "there is an equal playing field," or "pull yourself up by your bootstraps," and "all you have to do is work really hard," are damaging micro-invalidations and feed into the myth of meritocracy. Black women are often invalidated when expressing frustration and anger about experiences of racism by being labeled the angry Black woman. The bottom line is this: individual, systemic, and institutional racism exist as complex systems of oppression and cause psychological damage and life afflictions. As I mentioned previously, marginalized people have enough lived experiences to recognize racism and or racist activities because the feelings we have are irrefutable. The best way to handle your feelings is to accept that what just happened to you is real, and to believe it. Believe that you are qualified to know when someone has been racist toward you. Express these feelings with a qualified, culturally competent professional and someone close to you that you trust. Find a clinician who specializes in racial trauma or PTSD if you can. Additionally, if you are an ally who supports ethnic minorities, the best means of support is to listen. Even your best intentions can lead to further invalidation or insult, which can and most likely will worsen the situation. Research and read about racism and microaggressions and how they affect our minds and bodies. Understanding what's happened is the beginning to healing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlette. That is very, very informative. We're going to go on to the next speaker, who is Tobi. Hi, Tobi.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, Tobi is, I'm going to give a little introduction about a lot of people.
Sorry, go ahead.
We all know Tobi. Tobi is our guild president, current guild president. Okay, so what can I say about Tobi? Tobi studied French language for her undergraduate degree, and she studied international relations and diplomacy for her master's. Because she is the guild president, she represents the students on a daily basis to bring positive change, and she ensures that all the students have the best academic experience possible while they're at the university. I don't want to list all of the achievements, but I just want to highlight one achievement. She co-launched the Black Voices campaign to elevate the voices of Black students, along with Joshua, who's also with us. And she wants to tackle the 15% degree awarding gap and the 10% student satisfaction gap. So this Black Voices campaign has led to the development of a Black Voices manifesto. And her goal, her target is to campaign for this to be implemented across the university. And good luck, Tobi, and thank you for being one of the panelists. Thank you, Tobi.
Thank you very much, Sheeba. Good evening, everyone. So I am going to be very brief as I can. And basically we'll start off by giving a brief overview of what I'm working on, the Black Voices campaign, as Sheeba has mentioned, which is one of our priority campaigns at the Guild. So each year we have a couple of priority campaigns, and then, you know, we just based on the scores that came out of the NSS results, we decided to look into one of the pressing things in terms of Black student experience, tackling the attainment gap. And so we decided to launch a Black Voices campaign to that effect. Now, based on feedback from our students at the launch of the campaign, there was mention of microaggression, and I intend to cover that slightly in my overview. So like I said before, you know, we launched the campaign, and apart from microaggressions, there were a lot of things that came out of that in terms of academics, mental health and well-being, and as well as social experience. And like Sheeba mentioned, we've put all of this into a manifesto, and we've ever since been working and lobbying the university rather, in terms of how we can implement all of those changes. And I'll be happy to put the link in the chat at some point so that you can have a look at the manifesto. Now, in terms of microaggression, I know just based on the conversations that we had with students that a lot of students at the University of Birmingham who have highlighted that they've encountered microaggression, you know, during their studies, from academics and students alike. And oftentimes people tend to be microaggressive unintentionally. And I know that that is difficult and sometimes uncomfortable for people to confront their own biases and, you know, learn how to be anti-racist. But with this discussion, I'm hoping that from a personal perspective, I'll be able to answer questions, particularly around unintentional microaggression and how not to fall into that position, because Carlette, for instance, already gave a fantastic introduction as to what microaggressions are. And just apart from that, I'd just like to say that one of the reasons why I agreed to be on this panel is also to be able to gain more insight on the topic of microaggression. Nobody's perfect. And you know, just possibly to be able to leave this virtual room with more understanding on how we can help tackle the ongoing challenge, and just help our students have a more favorable university experience. So I'm very much open to questions. I intend to go with the flow and contribute to the discussions from a personal perspective, answer any questions that you may have in terms of unintentional microaggression, and just hopefully something good comes out of it. So yeah, very brief and very straight to the point. And I'm sorry if I haven't given enough details, and that's because my Wi-Fi is going to go off really soon. So I'm really hoping that I can still contribute as much as I can before this session ends. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tobi. And we really hope you can stay with us till the end to take some questions. Thank you so much for that talk on microaggressions. Next speaker from our panel is going to be Israel. Israel Tamale. He's a second-year student studying law with French at the University of Birmingham. I think he's the youngest of our panelists. He's the co-chair of the Black and Ethnic Minority Association. He was born in Switzerland to Ugandan parents and was raised in Canada. So he says he's no stranger to diversity. As an ethnic minority students officer in the Guild of Students, he strives to promote anti-discrimination and fairness for all people. Israel, when he was much younger, when he was doing his schooling, he launched a Success for All project in Canada, but working with high school students in Uganda. This was a project with an aim to level the playing field for students in Uganda. He started this project to improve opportunities for those high school students in Uganda to develop their entrepreneurship and networking skills. He's had a great experience working with students and high school students in Uganda, but he's doing a great job here as the co-chair of the Black and Ethnic Minority Association. So welcome, Israel, and thank you for agreeing to being on the panel.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, hi everyone, my name is Israel. I just wanted to start off by saying, you know, I'm not necessarily an expert on anything per se. You know, I'm only 20 years old. Not even halfway through my first degree. So I'm not necessarily coming here with facts or statistics or a lot of, I guess, scientific knowledge, let's say. I'm really just here to give my opinions, personal experiences that I've had. I'm here to share them with you. And I know just kind of give my take on microaggressions, which is not something that I am a stranger to. However, the actual term microaggressions is actually a term that I actually discovered earlier this year. So microaggressions as a word is new to me. It's something I wish I'd known earlier in my life. But nonetheless, at least I know it now and I can use it moving forward. So I don't want to go into like my whole life story, but to kind of give some context as to my personal experiences with microaggressions. I went to a predominantly white school. So from kindergarten up till the end of high school, I was lucky to go to private school, but the majority of the students that were there, the students and staff actually, were white and came from fairly well-off families. And because of that, you know, they had a lot of privilege that they might not have been aware of, but I won't speak too much on that. And you know, me being pretty much the only Black kid in my grade up until the latter half of my education, I kind of had to deal with a lot of the stereotypes that my classmates had. So some of the stereotypes that my classmates had of a Black boy in particular, in general, sorry, would be, you know, you grew up in the hood, you grew up in the ghetto, you would speak a certain type of way, you would act a certain type of way. so they kind of had like this image, this idea in their head, okay, this is what a black guy is, and kind of compared me to that and said, okay, you don't necessarily fit our description of like, you know, what a real black guy should be like. So, you know, does that mean like you're like half black? You're like, meh. And these are a lot of the things that I had to deal with, especially in high school, I guess, kind of when we were, you know, gaining our own consciousness and everything like that. A lot of comments with, I wouldn't necessarily say like my friend made it to like to make me personally feel bad based on my race, but you know, comments like oh, like you're an Oreo, which if you don't know is kind of like trying to say, you know, black on the outside, white on the inside. Casual throwing around of the N-word. I'm from Uganda originally, so you know, sometimes people making jokes are like, oh, you know, whenever you go back to Africa, you know, you go around with spears and you live in the jungle and that kind of thing. And you know, just these kind of jokes that, although perhaps on the surface, you know, they're not necessarily intended to have a negative effect, you know, deep down they really do, and they are really offensive to hopefully to anyone. But yeah, so these are things that were thrown my way, but because I was the only black kid, most of the time I was the only black kid in that space, I didn't necessarily feel confident enough to speak out about it. You know, they say there's strength in numbers, and if you're, you know, pretty much alone in the sea of people who are, you know, trying to go against you, let's say, it's kind of hard at times to you know, be that one person, be like, okay, this isn't right, or to speak out against injustices towards you. And I would say this is in part because of a lack of education. So I would like to think that, you know, none of my classmates did this from a place of hate, or they were intentionally trying to make me feel bad, or to be offensive or anything. I think for the most part, it was just they didn't really realize that what they were saying had a negative effect, or shouldn't be taken lightly. And that's partly because, you know, I didn't speak up about it. So that in a sense, I kind of empowered them to think like, okay, if he's not saying anything about it and he's fine with it, then there's no reason for me not to continue doing it. There was a lack of education in my household because, you know, my parents were born and raised in Uganda, so race isn't necessarily something that they grew up with. And because of that, it wasn't necessarily something that they could prepare me for as I grew up. It wasn't something that was taught in school because, you know, like I said, the majority of the staff members were white. I think maybe there was 2 black staff members, but they weren't teaching staff. I think one was a librarian and one was working in IT. So there wasn't necessarily spaces, let's say, to have conversations about these kind of things, or to actually speak about diversity in general, let's say. So that's a whole other point. But because of that, you know, that kind of, it negatively affected me in the sense that, you know, I didn't necessarily feel like I had the words, or, you know, I knew what I could say to speak up against people. Like I said, you know, microaggressions is literally a term that I learned this year. So I think that's at the core of what we need to look on when we're talking about microaggressions, you know, in the present day, and looking at what we can do to be an ally or to support people of ethnic minorities is, first of all, understanding these small things, these microaggressions that negatively impact us, in the sense that, you know, they're, you know, in the term, it's micro, so it's small, so it doesn't seem like, you know, it's not like blatant racism, like going up to someone and calling them a horrible thing or discriminating them in a sense. But, you know, small things can build up over time and they can blow up in a really bad way. So it's really tackling these small things that are, that in my opinion, there are important amongst other things. So really just the education and understanding what people find offensive, understanding why they're offensive, understanding, you know, history, understanding social mindsets that all play a factor into the differences of privilege that different communities get to enjoy. So yeah, I won't take up too much time, but thank you. listening to me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Israel. Thank you for sharing your experiences. Our next speaker, panel member, will be Yajur Arora. A little bit about Yajur. Yajur is a fourth-year international MBCHB student at the University of Birmingham. He's currently the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee's rep for the medical students. He was born in New Delhi, India, but he moved to Dubai. He did most of his schooling in Dubai and he came here to Birmingham. So he's an international student. Yajur is conscious about the ethnic inequalities and access to healthcare, especially for the migrants. He's conscious of the microaggressions that cause restrictions in access and limit outcomes for the migrant population. Hence, he's here to raise awareness and to influence social change in this aspect of microaggressions for healthcare access, especially with the migrant population. Thank you for joining us, Yajur.
Hey, thank you, Sheeba. Thank you for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's amazing to see the kind of turnout for this event. And yeah, I think just to start with, extremely grateful to have had the opportunity to be here with you guys today. It's a brilliant panel that we've got arranged, brilliant work done by Hazel and Sarah and Sheeba to set everything up. So like Sheeba said, I'm a medical student, and similar to Israel, I don't have a lot of context in terms of specialization in the field of microaggressions specifically, but it's something that I think is important to engage in and keep learning about. Personally, for me, I'm an EDI, so Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Student Ambassador for the MDS College. And in the capacity of that role, I think it's important for me to take these opportunities as we go, engage with people, engage with large crowds such as yourself, and try and keep learning and educating yourself on these matters. I think it's a brilliant opportunity to kind of discuss how microaggressions can be applicable to how you can understand more about microaggressions in a healthcare setting. So just a couple things I want to talk about, and before we move on to the panel and the rest of the speakers, I think just addressing my personal experiences with microaggressions, understanding microaggressions in the healthcare setting, kind of applying that to the work I've done in migrant healthcare, and yeah, just at the end, maybe seeing what we could all do about it. So I think to start with, so like Sheeba said, I'm an international student, raised in Dubai, and I went to an Indian international school. So personally for me, I think I found that as I grew older, I started to find myself in a more globalized environment. It was a bit of a micro environment by itself, being around so many people with similar experiences. And it was a very different experience, I think, to what people envision Dubai as being, particularly. But yeah, I think as I grew older, I recognized certain things that when you're in a shell or in a small environment with people that maybe don't have as much exposure to other groups, you start growing old and you recognize, you know, I hate this is wrong or that's wrong. Or you can't speak to someone like this. You can't have these opinions or this type of bias, and you kind of keep educating yourself. That was a very important experience for me. And then as I went along, I came here, of course, and it was just something that I continued to expand upon, something I continued to work upon. And I think it's really important to recognize the impacts of microaggressions in the circles of education, the circles that we're in today. And it's important to recognize that as the world is getting more increasingly aware that these microaggressions actually have more sinister impacts than we come to recognize. And also to, I think personally for me, it's really important to evaluate the privilege I have coming into this, and recognizing how I can be an ally to more marginalized groups that are kind of affected maybe worse than I am. Personally, I think I've had a very positive experience for a lot of my life. I've been quite sheltered, and I've had a lot of privilege being in the position that I am in today. And I think a lot of my work kind of revolves around being an ally, really. So kind of looking at understanding microaggressions in healthcare settings. So it's a bit about looking at, so as a medical student, I think you have to kind of segregate it into different components, medical students, healthcare professionals, and patients, the different deliveries, different systems in play there. And you have to understand how you can tackle these things separately, individually, because they all have their own set of problems, and then try and do it simultaneously so the system kind of gets better from the ground up. I think for me personally, coming here, a lot of the things that I face, which is really weird because you think you come to a very educated environment where people are more aware but you still find this conversation that occurs so much about certain people being like, wow, your English is so good for an international student, or you don't look Indian, or your accent isn't what we expected it to be. Certain kind of microaggressions or assumptions about intelligence associated with your ethnicity, depictions of certain kind of values that you might have, or upbringings that you might have because you're from a certain community, really. I think that kind of stuff was really startling for me, because I'm like, when I came here, I remember speaking to my parents about it. And I think one of the first things that my dad told me was really like, don't engage in, we're not sending you to be an activist, we're sending you there to become a healthcare professional, really. So try and stray away from like engaging with people that might be quite, that might present a threat to you, really. Try and like, and you think that, oh, these things when you come here are going to be so obvious, like it's going to be so glaring, like people are going to come and have these conversations with you. But no, it's actually these microaggressions that you're presented with in settings that you wouldn't expect it to be with, whether it's through a senior healthcare professional, whether it's through a colleague or a peer. So I think that was something that was really interesting to recognize. And as a result, I think something that the MDS College has done well is create a reporting tool for kind of reporting all kinds of EDI issues. But something that would be, that I have wanted to feed back into that is also reporting microaggressions in the workplace. And I think that's a big step forward in addressing these kind of issues. I think additionally, looking at things like how microaggressions kind of tie into the larger picture of healthcare conditions. There's been a lot of progress, a lot of work in the recent times, and a lot of people being a bit outraged about things like, for example, in dermatology, there are people whose skin colors would reflect differently for different conditions, but we just don't know about these things, and kind of starting to educate each other on those matters and how that ties in. It comes down to an issue of race, really. And also some people are predisposed to certain conditions genetically, but sometimes it can be a bit upsetting when someone presents it to you in a way that, oh, because you're from this ethnicity, you'll have this. That seems a bit of a, that seems like you're making a bit of a assumption or a stereotype there, but it's not really that. I think it's like going about understanding how you can have those conversations and explain that to patients better. And just to wrap up, so the work I kind of do in terms of outside of the medical school, I engage with an organization called Docs and Cops. That's an organization that works in activism, and kind of the main aim has been to combat the hostile environment that's present in the NHS. And that hostile environment is something that's faced towards migrant groups, in particular vulnerable groups such as refugees and asylum seekers. And there are a lot of microaggressions when you look at those groups as such from a healthcare setting. It's being peddled from a higher level of media outlets saying that these people are coming here using our healthcare, whereas there are many factual problems with that, really. People are getting detached from the conversation to do with humanity and the actual reasons why people are forced to be displaced and come to a place that is alien to them. And there are many issues in terms of when they do come here, they're faced with a lot of challenges which will take a physical and mental toll, and things that they might have faced on their journey here. And in terms of their access to healthcare and their experience, it's very negative, and that comes down to things that might not always be as glaring. Like I previously mentioned, it might come down to smaller things. It might come down to conversations that they might have. That I've spoken to a lot of people that have come from these backgrounds, and the assumptions that sometimes they even face within healthcare settings is that, oh, we didn't know that you're this educated. Or sometimes you even come across people that are doctors back home, and then they come here, and because of the language barriers, there's certain difficulties that they face, but these presumptions are made that that you're not a professional, whereas you were back home, whereas you did have a degree of respect and a degree of certain lifestyle over there. Difference is that when you come here, you face microaggressions in every aspect, whether it's in day-to-day life, whether it's in access to healthcare, whether it's in the legal system. And I think the kind of work that I do with this organization, we've started to look a bit more into, I think it'll be really interesting to look into smaller scale stuff, just look into where day-to-day conversations occur and how these microaggressions kind of perpetuate the hostile environment in the NHS, and how it also comes in the way of sometimes maybe treatments or in terms of interactions with patients and the kind of patient outcomes that it would affect. It's really important to make sure people are comfortable in these settings. When it comes to healthcare, it's a very private, personal matter. And microaggressions can go a long way in displacing that conversation and making someone less likely to engage in that conversation with you, to give a more holistic picture of what they're experiencing. So I think that is kind of where it ties in for me personally. And if anyone is interested, I'm happy to always have that discussion as well. And I'm obviously conscious of time, so I think to conclude, again, really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful to be in the panel and answer some of your questions. And I think going forward about what we can do to break the cycle. Something that Israel said was really important is about engaging in conversations and educating yourself. Nothing can change from the outside until you begin that process internally. I think it's really important to begin that and bring in that your immediate groups. So starting conversations, engaging in grassroots level conversations, recognizing these microaggressions and addressing them, and then seeing what you can do maybe to work with organizations, societies, look at opportunities at larger scales, and kind of finally to wrap up to really look after yourself when it comes to your individual discrimination that you might face in terms of microaggressions, and also the kind of, if you're looking to engage in that on a larger level, to kind of find how you can develop support systems to be strong enough to address this and keep fighting that fight, really. But that's that for me. Thank you guys so much, and I'm looking forward to the panel.
Thank you, Yajur. Thank you for sharing your insight from a different perspective, from the healthcare perspective. The next speaker on our panel is going to be Joshua. Joshua, a few words about Joshua. Hi, Joshua. So, okay. Joshua is a journalist. He's a social activist. He's a city ambassador. He's a writer. He's a media personality and a showbiz presenter. So I can go on and on about Joshua, but most importantly, Joshua was our student president, guild president last year. And he's a Brahmi. He wants me to introduce him as a Brahmi. He's really proud to be a Brahmi. He was born and brought up in Birmingham. He completed his UG degree in political science and international relations. And he's currently studying his master's in poverty, inequality and development at the University of Birmingham. Joshua has spent much of his career tackling inequality whilst championing the voices of the minority. He's worked both regionally and nationally. He's worked with the government's all-party parliamentary groups to push for legislative changes for matters relating to looking after children, and the government advisor on care leavers. He's worked with the National Youth Advocacy Service, and he has also worked with Tobi on co-launching the Black Voices campaign at the University of Birmingham to elevate the experiences of Black students. I'll stop now. He's got a whole list of voluntary work, but thank you, Joshua, for joining us on the panel. Joshua aims to leave the world a better place, and I think he's on track already. So thank you for joining us, Joshua.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for such a wonderful introduction as well. I've kind of sat here with my heart beating, and then hearing that was really, really lovely. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got a little presentation. Oh, I don't think I'm able to share screen.
I'll do it for you, Joshua.
Oh,
I'll put it up. Yeah, I'll put it up. Okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
No problem.
This is the awkward moment now where we just wait.
Sorry, it's taking its time. Sorry.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you. So if we can just stay on the first page for now. But I am really, really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful to have been asked to be on this panel. And I think it's really, really interesting when we talk about microaggressions on the basis that it seems sometimes that they're unimportant. We say, as we've seen already through other speakers, we say that they're small, we say that they're subtle. So surely their impact would be negligible. Why do we spend so much time focusing on them? Why do we spend so much time talking about them? Why do we do sessions like this? And realistically, microaggressions may seem small, but they can have a massive impact, not just on the individual, but on society as a whole. So I wanted to give a brief overview of microaggressions in the context of a kind of political arena, but there's a lot to kind of cover, so I'll try to break it down as fast as I can. But I'll be looking at microaggressions and tribalism, and as I like to call it, because I'm dramatic, I call it a political ticking time bomb. So on the first slide, dependent on context, microaggressions can often be politically loaded and for purpose. So in left spaces, they are a clear example of how discrimination and stereotypes can impact everyday life. But notably, they are subtle, but they are impactful, reminding minorities and marginalized groups that they are still the other in a society that was built without them in mind. But in right spaces, microaggressions are just yet another attempt to police and condemn harmless, unimportant behavior and constrain freedom of speech. In both spaces though, microaggressions as a concept and a term has become innately political and risks falling victim to the ongoing right versus left culture war. So a large risk in discussing and tackling microaggressions is that we often discuss them within our own spaces, which fast become our own echo chambers, inhibiting our ability to enact long-lasting change. But I'd like to consider microaggressions in reference to political tribalism. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you, Sheeba. So political tribalism, quite simply, can be seen as a very strong feeling of loyalty to a political or social group. And this feeling can be so strong, it causes members of the tribe to pledge support and allegiance no matter what they do. Tribes demand loyalty, and they offer a sense of belonging in return. Humans are social animals, and realistically, at our very core, down in our DNA, all we want is that sense of belonging and stability. But with political tribalism, though, we lose our ability to become reflective, to sit back and critique. Regardless of where you stand politically, these tribes are competing for power over the state, the media, and public opinion. So I found a cool little article earlier, and one thing really stood out to me, and that is that when politics becomes a perpetual tribal war, ends justify almost any means, and individuals are absolved from the constraints of normal moral decency. People who would never tolerate cruelty or lying, or even ordinary impoliteness in their children, cheer every excess of their leaders, and this is more prevalent in Donald Trump. As the global sphere, particularly in the UK and the US, has become more polarised, tribalism has become a dominating factor within our already populist political systems. And what begins as a microaggression, a subtle dig at someone's identity, evolves in a tribalist political system, should it not be challenged from the onset. What was initially harmless becomes cemented in public discourse and is weaponized to sow mistrust between different groups or tribes, gain political prowess, and dehumanize others. And if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. But realistically, why do microaggressions matter? And more importantly, why do they matter in the context of tribalism? So they matter because they are all around us and we need to continue to see them clearly and challenge them. Within politics and leadership positions, your voice is elevated and your words have maximum weight and maximum impact. This can be used for purpose, or it can be used to degrade others. We see Republicans, conservatives, and anti-Black tribes in the United States whipping up racial hatred against Obama using a common microaggression that he isn't really American, that he should go back to where he came from, that he forged his documentation. And this is now repeating with Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris. What is an outrageous and racially loaded claim has now become acceptable in public discourse. We see Boris Johnson compare Muslim women to letterboxes, calling gay men tanked-up bum boys, and Black Africans pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. These microaggressions and stereotypes are justified by his supporters. He clearly didn't mean them the way they came across. It was harmless. However, that's what microaggressions are. They're subtle, although these ones I would argue are very much not subtle. But now we see these same comments being used across the country to degrade minority groups. The correlation does not mean causation. We see hate crime rising across the UK and violent attacks on minority groups on the rise too, using the exact same stereotypes and tropes Boris Johnson and his supporters refused to condemn. What were outrageous and discriminatory claims have now become acceptable in public discourse. Common tropes and microaggressions that exist against minority groups are not standalone throwaway phrases. They are loaded and they have power. And in the right hands, they can whip a tribe into action and segregate a nation. When we blindly follow our affiliated tribes, these microaggressions continue to grow. They are no longer subtle. They are prominent. They are believed. They have relentless power. They may just be words, but I'd argue words are often the most powerful tools that we possess. And we must maintain our strength in our commitment to challenging and fighting them. And if we go to the last slide. But realistically, I've spoken to you all a lot. I've waffled a little bit, but why does it matter? Microaggressions are subtle, small, and negligible at first. They are rooted in misinformation and a lack of education, and a lot of the time are genuinely not meant to cause distress, but they do. They are often that unconscious bias that comes to the forefront just for a moment and is not thought about again. But to the person on the receiving end, it leaves a lasting mark. Factor political tribalism into this, and now they have become established. A whole tribe following each other blindly and without critique allows microaggressions to manifest. They become stereotypes, they become established, they're comedic, they're accepted. Then they make us look at each other just that little bit differently. We begin to mistrust each other. They grow and grow from something so minor until they are a battle cry. And it doesn't end at that speech or at that rally or in that classroom. It influences the way that we view one another, how we value each other, and who is important and who is expendable. We've seen microaggressions form the basis of stereotypes that has led to hostile legislation, civil unrest, ethnic cleansing, genocide. And this is fueled by the power of tribalism with leaders who capitalize on the lack of compassion that we have for each other. Politics is chaotic at the best of times and confusing at others, and we look to our elected leaders to guide us. We place our trust in them. However, we should not and cannot pledge allegiance to them blindly and lose sight of our ability to be a constructive and critical friend. We see Donald Trump utilising common microaggressions and stereotypes against minorities to gain political favour under his Make America Great Again slogan. We see the impact that this has had on minority groups and fueling civil unrest in the States. But this isn't just an American issue, although it's one of the strongest examples. We all have our part to play in combating this. It may be within our homes, within our schools, our workplaces, our events. When we see microaggressions and turn a blind eye, we negate our responsibility and allow it to fester. They're rooted in often unconscious stereotypes that we have about our fellow people. See challenging them as an opportunity to better understand one another, to see another's point of view, to be a more inclusive individual. Because realistically, and I hate to end on a negative note, but a failure to do this will just lead to further polarization in our politics, and it will be the most marginalized people within our communities that bear the brunt of this. We're already seeing this, and we all have a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. That was very political, but very necessary at this time. Our final speaker for this event is Daniel Stone. Hello, Daniel. Just a few words about Daniel. He's the project manager of knowledge exchange at the University of Birmingham, and he's the author of the memoir After Oxford. So you might have guessed he went to Oxford for his undergraduate degree. He studied economics and management for his undergraduate degree at Oxford. While at Oxford, he campaigned on a student access, racial awareness, equality, and he was elected the student rep at Oxford. Daniel grew up in a socially conscious family in Handsworth in Birmingham, but he was the first person from his comprehensive school to study at the University of Oxford. He has been aware of the challenges that Black students face in getting access to higher education. So he worked as an access scheme trainer to dispel myths about getting into Oxford from a minority community. He's also held roles in which he's designed and delivered strategies for improving the employability outcomes of students from the widening participation backgrounds. Daniel's social activism includes serving as the chair of Board of Trustees for Young People Matter. He has worked with young people raising aspirations in schools. He's organized inner city community in East London to provide a response to the knife crime threat. Along with all that, he also did his master's in educational planning, economics and international development in UCL. So thank you very much for joining us, Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you. And yes, it definitely sounds like I've been busy over the past few years. But yeah, good evening to you all. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak. And so I think the first thing I just wanted to mention is, and I think in the introduction, I think some of my background was spoken about in terms of actually growing up in Handsworth in a really multicultural area of Birmingham, and then moving then to study at the University of Oxford. And I remember kind of being involved in this particular student campaign called the 100 Voices campaign, where we tried to capture the experiences, good, bad, and otherwise, of 100 kind of BAME students within the University of Oxford. And I remember after we'd kind of pulled together this report, we had a meeting with the Pro-Vice Chancellor, who was responsible for equalities issues within the University of Oxford. And he began the meeting by saying that there was no racism in Oxford. And I think, as Carlette mentioned earlier, that's probably the epitome of somebody kind of having kind of micro invalidations, or probably in that case, macro invalidations. But thankfully, we then had a report that we could then show to him to then actually prove the effects that people were having during their studies in the University of Oxford. And I think there has now hopefully been a bit of a shift where people within senior leadership positions are kind of moving from that area of not being aware or not recognizing kind of disparities to do with race, to now actually seeking to think about how they make some of their institutions more inclusive places to be. So I could kind of use the rest of my time to talk about some of the other microaggressions that I faced, both within the context of being a student and also within the working environment. But I actually thought it might be more helpful for me to actually give an example, not where I was a victim, but actually where I was a perpetrator of microaggressions. And as mentioned, I'm a project manager at the university. And so often I have the chance to work with a number of kind of contractors on a number of different projects. And it tends to be that the majority of contractors tend to be white men. But I think on this particular project, there were also 2 men of British Indian ethnicity who I'd met kind of months and months ago. And then when I went back on site, I was told that I would have to kind of contact or meet, let's call his name Raj, at the site, to then kind of have a bit of a site tour. And I think in that situation, if that person's name had been what I conceived as being a kind of white British name, I would have humbly kind of asked somebody, you know, is this so-and-so? Can you point them out? And I would have done it that way. But given that there were kind of 2 people who I thought that name might belong to, and also given, to be quite honest, my own kind of sense of overconfidence, I then decided to go and to somebody who was sat down and asked him if he was Raj, and he said no, he was the other person. So I think for some people they may see that as a fairly trivial example, but I think the reason why I mentioned that is because actually the heart and motivation behind what led me to making that decision can also be at the heart of actually some more serious cases of microaggression. I think it's that sense of overconfidence, lack of humility, thoughtlessness, and actually just a general irrational standpoint, that I think if we actually stood back and actually analysed and critiqued some of our thinking and challenged our ways of thinking and engaged critically with the world around us, then I think it would lead us to actually making decisions that we're conscious of and that don't negatively affect others around us. So I think I'll probably end there with that example, and look forward to hearing questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Daniel. I know we are running over. If all the panelists can switch on their videos, we can take some questions. If you have, because we're running late, we'll take a few questions from the registrants, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. If you have to leave, we're very sorry. This is being recorded, so hopefully it'll be available for you later. We've lost Tobi because of internet issues, but the rest of the panel are here. So I'm just going to start with the questions from the people who registered. So the first question is to Daniel, and Carlette can help as well. So what do you think the college can do to take a more active role in forming a more diverse workforce, especially at senior levels with professional services?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I think with the kind of race equality charter and a number of other initiatives, I think there has been an effort to kind of really think about how we make our kind of workplace a more inclusive and diverse place, and one that's reflective of the wider city. So I think there's definitely things that can be done in terms of kind of advertising and seeking to actually broaden the application pool. But I know that actually when you look at the data, apparently the kind of drop-off rate at each stage of an application process seems to increase for people who are from diverse backgrounds. So kind of progressing from kind of applying to then getting an interview to then getting through the interview and getting the post. So I know there are initiatives that are trying to get kind of external people to sit on interviews, so that actually interview panels are more diverse. So I think that is important. And then I think the specific issue around senior leadership is challenging. I think when you think about the legacies of kind of discrimination, that especially when I think about the discrimination that my parents' generation faced, and they did it, and all the people who were in their network, and they knew of one person who had gone to higher education. So when you're then looking to have people in senior leadership roles, then actually they haven't had the opportunities that kind of we maybe have had to then be able to climb up the ladder and achieve those particular positions of seniority.
Carlette, would you like to add to that?
Well, I just think that policies and procedures are only as effective as well as they are enforced. So you can have all the policies in the world, but if they aren't followed through, then they really aren't that very helpful. I think that hiring practices in academia and are far beyond microaggressions. I mean, we're moving into institutional and structural and systemic racism at that point. So I think that the question is a little more complex. The answer for that is a little more complex. But there are qualified, certainly there are qualified BAME applicants worldwide applying for universities and colleges. But until there is much more work at a much more macro level, it'll be challenging at best to handle those types of issues.
Thank you, Daniel and Carlette. There's one question about how to be a good ally. And if you're a white person, how can you be a good ally without projecting yourself as the white savior? Would you be able to take that, Joshua, for us? Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. I think especially since the Black Lives Matter movement and the amount of resources that were shared since then, this has become quite a common question, and I think it's a completely valid one as well. But the one thing that I would say in being an ally is to make sure that it's centering voices that are different to your own and positioning them as a platform. However, it's increasingly important to make sure that you're not placing the entire burden onto that individual, whether they're an ethnic minority or another marginalized person. It's incredibly important that you don't rely on their emotional labor to teach you and to educate you and to bring you up to speed. There are so many resources out there now. There is the Free Black University, for example. There's so many texts by some fantastic authors. Angela Davis is one of my favorites, for example. It takes that individual responsibility to research and to educate ourselves. And when you think there are lapses in your knowledge or you're not too sure, you can research that. And then if you still need to, if you still need more understanding and more to learn, that's when you can kind of reach out to your peers and they'll be more than happy to help you. But I think it's just about that individual responsibility of knowing that it's exhausting sometimes to bring somebody up to speed and to educate and to talk about our personal life experiences, which might be fueled in trauma. But just coming in from an angle of knowing that you've got the education behind you, or you've read a resource, or you've gone out of your way to try to understand something, it puts me at ease in talking about my experiences with you, because I know that you've got a level of understanding. But it also means that it's not emotional labor, and importantly, not unpaid emotional labor that I'm doing. But I think that's a bit of waffle, but I think that answers the question.
Thank you, Joshua.
Sheeba, would you mind if I added something to that?
Sure, Carlette.
To speak directly to the allies because I want allies to understand that their role is extremely important. And what I find that I appreciate the most of allies is allowing us to express anger, because I think a lot of times our anger at being victimized by racism is often weaponized against us. And I think I feel the safety and comfort with my allies when they don't take it personally when I am angry about being a victim of racism, and they listen. They don't necessarily offer their opinion, but they just listen. And I think that the trauma and anxiety and depression that goes along with experiencing racial trauma is helpful when allies just allow us to express that anger and to know that it's not personal at that moment. We are angry at the issue, not necessarily angry at the person. So I just wanted to add that little bit.
Thank you, Carlette. That's really helpful. Thank you. There was another question. What are the steps in place to tackle microaggression at the university? Example, the support for students that are in place. Would you be happy to take that, Israel?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess there's different avenues you can take. You can take the avenue through the school in the sense of reporting any hate incidents. There's a difference between hate crimes and hate incidents. Hate crimes is really, if there's an actual crime, then that's something that, you have to take to the police. If it's a hate incident, then there's, you can report to the school, you can report through the guild. You can, I would think that, well-being staff members and well-being services are also available for you to use of and take advantage of. So yeah, just making sure that you know the right avenues. And I am trying to work on trying to make sure that that is available for people, so that, you don't necessarily have to go digging in like all the hard places for it. I think it's really important that this is something that, if God forbid that if you do feel like you need to use these avenues, that it's not necessarily something that's privileged information, that it should be available for everyone.
Is it okay if I add to that? Because I think there was another question.
Yes, so
just because I think Sandra asked a question about the Mds reporting tool that I mentioned. So I think it is one of those things that Israel said, that you have to like kind of signpost to people. You want to make it more accessible, something that people don't have to kind of dig up and like find, being like when they've already had something that they've had difficulty with. You don't want to make their life harder, to present more barriers essentially in terms of helping them. But I think so the reporting tools is something that we're hoping to kind of tackle hate incidents, and reporting tools for microaggressions are things that you might face from people at more senior level, because when you are in MDS and when you're placed outside of the university setting, you tend to be in a very diverse group of people across the spectrum of posts. So you have very senior people, you have people that are your colleagues, you have people that are your peers, you have someone that's a fifth-year medical student just a year above you, someone that's a year below you. So the hope for the reporting tool is really that something that kind of covers a diverse range, kind of allows people to put in their information, put in what they might have faced. And in terms of how that's being escalated, at the moment, it's something that's being escalated internally. It gets escalated amongst the welfare group and also amongst the staff that are directly involved. And it gets, if it's something that's in terms of, this is a very specific example, but if it's something that has to do with a consultant saying something that's slightly discriminatory to a student, it can be something that will get escalated to staff members and escalated to groups that are individually in charge of undergrad students within the hospital setting, and will be addressed one-on-one with that consultant. So there are different avenues depending on really what the scenario was and what happened. And I think right now my role is to hopefully expand the accessibility to that tool and make it something that everyone's quite aware of. So I think, yeah, that's just something I wanted to add in.
Thank you, Yajur. Thank you for answering that question on Q&A. Most frequently, people have asked, do we confront them? How do we do it without causing offense? So any tips? Yes, Joshua, thank you.
I think it's really interesting, because how do we how do we combat microaggressions without causing offense? But microaggressions in themselves are causing offense to people. They are making them feel less than, they are making them feel other, they are making them feel dehumanized and degraded. So combating that, if it causes offense, I don't want to be mean, but if it causes offense, that's kind of on them. Because if you're being called out for doing something wrong, it's an opportunity to better yourself. How you respond to that dictates your character. I'm sat on this panel, but I can 100% hold my hands up and say that I have not got it right in the 22 years I've been on this planet. But it is good friends and peers and staff and networks around me that have challenged me constructively on things. It's not about condemning somebody and being you're an awful person, but just putting them to the side. Just are you really sure about that? Small, simple things that can make me step back or make the individual step back and just think about it. I know we're British. We're scared of everything. We apologize for everything, but it's fine. Kind of keep your conviction. It's okay to call people out. And if they are close to you as well, or if they're in your kind of networks and support bubbles, they would appreciate it. It allows you to be comfortable knowing that you haven't been a bystander in a situation, and it allows them to grow as an individual and be better and more inclusive. And I think that's a positive on both sides.
Thank you, Joshua. Daniel, is it possible for us to give us some tips on if the microaggression is from authoritative figures such as lecturers or coaches? Could you give us some tips on how to confront them or talk to them about it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think when you have that power dynamic between yourself and perhaps kind of fearing, then to raise something with somebody who's in a position of authority above you. And I suppose with my experience, and I reference this in terms of things that I did while being a student, what was to kind of think about how I could kind of build my kind of support base. So rather than going and speaking as an individual, who that individual then might be able to dismiss as being, you know, sensitive or whatever terms they want to kind of put on it. I think actually kind of the fact that we were able to go as a collective and actually show that this wasn't an isolated incident, but that was affecting a range of people, that then kind of had a number of different effects. So it both kind of validated what we were saying is actually being something that he needed to think about. And then it also then enforced the fact that action needed to be taken as well. So I think it can be difficult, I think, when there is that kind of difference in power. So I think you do have to be probably cautious of actually, well, I wouldn't say cautious, but be strategic about how you actually go about presenting the information, both for your own kind of well-being and protection, but also then to ensure that it has the effect that it needs to have in terms of driving thought and change.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. The next question is, what do you think is the most important way that we spread more awareness of these issues to our family and friends? Yajur, are you happy to take this question? Thank you, Yajur.
Cool. Sorry, I think I was muted there for a second.
No.
Yeah, this is, I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because coming from the background that I come from, I think you kind of realize, like, I was in a very unique position being in Dubai, where a lot of my family was back home in India, and now I've jumped again, and now a lot of my family's back home in Dubai, and I'm over here, and it's just like, when you go from place to place, there's obviously different level of engagement that everyone has in terms of their immediate surroundings. I think when it comes down to engaging with people, it's very important to put context behind it. Not everyone has the privilege to certain information or certain kind of global settings that you have that you have access to. I think education, this is why it comes in really importantly for me, because it kind of exposes you, it allows you to grow as an individual, continue to learn more. Like when you are engaging with other people in those conversations, personally, I found that the first thing that you don't want to do is seem condescending or patronizing, because you're not there to tell people how to be a better human being. And I think when it comes down to talking with your family and friends, if there are incidents or particular things that you think have been incorrect, kind of engaging in that discussion. And like Joshua said, it really comes down to a reflection of their character, how they kind of react to that, really. And another thing I think that was really cool that Carlette raised earlier was about how people can often gaslight you in these conversations. I think that's something that happens really often, where they'll be like, well, that wasn't really my intention. And you kind of see that repetitive behavior in them, and you're like, well, it's kind of hard for that not to be your intention when it's so reflective of how you look at things. So I think it's really important to be understanding of where people are coming from, whether it's a place of ignorance, or whether it's a place of something that they're intentionally, continuously kind of reinforcing or kind of discriminating certain person or anyone because of. And I think it's important to always be mindful that you're not condescending, patronizing when you have those discussions, when you have those engagements. And also is, I think the most important thing really that boils down to is these conversations cannot happen often over just one conversation. From your end, there has to be a willingness to understand that this kind of thing requires consistent engagement, and that will take personal effort and energy from you as well. So finding avenues, I guess, to kind of put all of that together, being like, how much time and effort do I have to talk to this person? How they react to it is not necessarily an indictment of what I've said to them, but more so of their character, and being kind of careful in how you engage in those discussions. Because like I said, you don't want to come across as being condescending, especially if it comes from a place of someone not being educated on a matter that you might have had privy or privilege to having been educated on.
Thank you, Yajur. Thank you. There's a question about the philosophy and critical theories. Are the Western dominant philosophy and critical theories, their denseness and complexity, are they a microaggression in themselves? How far do they stop people with low social, political, and economic capital from participating in and leading liberation movements? Carlette, are you happy to take this question about the theories, Western theories, and how they perpetuate or their microaggression themselves?
Question. Yeah. That's a hard question.
Yeah.
Well, I'm American, so I'm unique to the group in that aspect. And, America was founded on racism. And, racism is a core value of America, according to Marcianis. And I don't think capitalism would exist without racism, because you need the oppressed, you need the working class, you need the minimum wage jobs in order for capitalism to thrive. So I do believe that the Western philosophies, or some of the theories, actually perpetuate racism and encourage it. And in America, if you even utter the name Karl Marx or communism or socialism, I mean, people are ready to fight. So, Americans are a weird bunch. I mean, they hate socialism, but yet, a lot of them are on welfare. So, I mean, it doesn't, it just doesn't make sense. America, I think we are seeing an example of how Black Lives Matter is being now demonized and weaponized as a terrorist organization, and Antifa is now, Satan's army, and it's just, it's a bad situation, and I think I've said my point. I think that yeah, just that's it. That's how I answer that question.
Is that okay? Yeah. Sorry, I just stood up to go to my bookshelf to get some recommended reading.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel.
The Oppressed, which I think is a fantastic book in terms of actually shaping that kind of understanding of how we actually both stand with oppressed peoples to help them understand the reality that they're in, with a view to them being able to then critically engage with it and then transform it. So I think the kind of question is correct in that I think sometimes the way that society has been framed, both from an intellectual perspective, but also just from our lived experience and the fact that we're conditioned to accept the reality that we're in, means that it does take a process of education and re-education for us then to begin to realize the power that we have to be able to transform it. So I'd recommend Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Thank you, Daniel. I was going to come to you, but you volunteered. Thank you so much. There's a question for Joshua. Joshua, I found your presentation really interesting. You spoke about the effect of racist rhetoric inherent in politics. How would you imagine this ever be dissolved? As we have seen, progress made by parties with Black men and women in senior positions, but still there's a visible way to go. Do you think this visceral use of racism in politics will ever change? Wow.
That is such a juicy question. Whoever wrote that, you really love the drama and I'm here for it. I've just loaded up the question myself just so I can try and answer it as best as I can. So when it comes to dissolving racism within politics anyway, you've already stated that racist rhetoric is inherent in politics, and that's because I don't think that will ever realistically, oh, somebody's unpopular. I don't think that will ever realistically go away on the basis that politics, again, to go back to my presentation earlier, is innately tribal, but there are winners and losers. Politics is stacked up so that there are clear winners and clear losers. And for that, to be able to gain political prowess, to be able to get into certain positions and get certain things done and be able to pass the things that your pressure groups would want you to do, there needs to be an opposite, there needs to be a binary. And for that, there will always be somebody on the receiving end. So we see in the US with Donald Trump, we see who was in his first election campaign, who was it that he was demonizing? It was those from Latin America, particularly Mexico. We look at Duda in Poland. He was teetering on not getting re-elected. So what did he do? He started a culture war against LGBTQ plus people and really honed in on that rhetoric. We look at the UK right now. We look at big man Boris Johnson. We look at Priti Patel. We look at Matt Hancock. We look at these people that are demonizing the working class for asking for our children to be fed. There is always an other, and until we, and I don't think it will happen anytime soon, but until we eliminate racism in society, racist tropes are still something that can be utilized to be able to gain. Oh, I've lost the rest of the question. Oh, the rest of the question's gone. But I think the rest of the question was referring to kind of what can we do, I think. And I think what we need to do is we need to be able to, again, call it out, to be able to challenge when our leaders do things that, when our leaders say and do things that we wouldn't accept from our children, from our families, from our friends, we should not accept it blindly. We shouldn't justify it. I've had so many arguments with my friends on the complete opposite political spectrum to me, who would willingly stick their heart on the line to justify a man that I am saying has done some very awful things and said some very, very awful things. If we wouldn't accept it within your own household, don't accept it from your political leaders. Challenge them, sign a petition, get involved in activism. Whatever vessel you have, utilize it, because without you, things will not change. And when we, I just want to focus on activism for a second, because when we say activism, we usually mean people with really funny slogans with a placard marching through the streets. Great, but that is one type of activism. We also need our people that are plugging things on social media, our writers, our artists, our people that are spreading the message in ways that we can never imagine. I know that the most powerful asset that I have is my voice, and that's why I'll always sit on a panel or do a video or do an event, because I can chat for England. However, I know that academically, probably not the best way to get my thoughts out. Play to your strengths, utilize the voice and the impact that you can have, and use that to fuel change, because political systems are supposed to work for us. And when they don't, we are well within our rights, however you want to see it, as a population, as an electorate, as a consumer, we are well within our rights to be able to challenge that and demand better.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you very much. There's one more question we'd like to ask, that's from the audience. This is an anonymous attendee who says, I'd like to ask the panel how they would recommend white people should compliment BAME acquaintances without engaging in microaggression. The reason I ask is because during each of the talks given by the panelists, I caught myself thinking, hey, this person is really articulate. And I feel, obviously, I would have said this to the panelists, irrespective of the color of their skin. Essentially, I don't want to offend or engage in covert racism, but simultaneously would like to express my gratitude and respect. Could the panel comment on this, and what would they recommend? Any takers?
I'll take
Carlette, go on.
Yeah, I read that comment, and the first thing I thought is like, well, wait a minute, you know, we can't be a society where we are afraid to say everything. You know, I personally would not be offended if someone called me articulate. That just proves the money that I've spent in my education was worth it. So I would say thank you and go about my merry way. I do understand that, you know, we are in a climate where people are offended, but we cannot live our lives walking on eggshells. And I think any rational person would not be offended by that. And I think if they are, they will let you know. But I mean, the worst thing that I would want to see is people to become so sensitive or so conscious of what they say that they're worried about offending somebody, because I probably said something tonight that offended somebody and it wasn't intentional. So I saw the person who wrote that, and I just want to say what you want to say, you know, and you know, we know how to take it. We really do. We're okay with that.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Just to wrap up, I'm sorry we couldn't take all the questions. There's like plenty of questions, but we couldn't, because of lack of time, we couldn't answer all the questions. But just to wrap up, I just want to ask a question to all the panelists. What will be your one take-home message to our audience? Just one bullet point. We'll start with Daniel, because Daniel's first on my screen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, I think my point would be just the importance of critical thinking, as we're in an academic institution. So critical thinking, both for yourself as an individual and also for the wider society that we're living in.
Thank you, Daniel. Israel?
I think I would just reiterate what I said before about the education. Just being open-minded and being able to take criticism, or being able to, you know, put your pride to the side for a bit and listen to what people are saying. Similar to what Joshua said earlier, you know, you need to be, I think one of the best ways to learn is to actually, you know, you need to like sit down and listen. And if someone's telling you something that's offensive or anything, being able to actually like take that in, evaluate, okay, maybe this is what I'm doing that isn't right or is wrong. And then trying to like actively change your habits and change your thinking, questioning different thoughts that you have. And also just like really trying to put yourself in spaces where you're able to understand the situation better. And that's a mix of, you know, going and actively looking for the information yourself. But then also, you know, if you do have people who are willing to talk about it, then being willing to listen, like Joshua said, you know, uplifting their voices, not necessarily putting your opinion at the forefront, you know, just really giving the mic to people who maybe haven't necessarily had the chance to speak out before. And yeah, just staying educated, being educated.
Thank you, Israel. Yajur?
Yeah, so I think kind of similar points to what everyone else probably has to add. But I think two things that were personally important to me when coming up against this and being like, oh, how can you start? How can you change things? And you're like, wow, there's so much to change. And where do you even begin, really, sometimes? But I think it comes down to a very individual level. Two most important things, I guess, when you're looking at how you can tackle this is, I don't mean to steal Josh's thunder, but I think what he said about using your voice is so important. I think we all have more power within us than we realize, we recognize. The organization that I started with, Docs Not Clubs, kind of just use avenues with the work that you're doing to see, okay, how can I apply this to a larger setting? How can I amp this up? How can I help people? And kind of being realistic in how this is going to impact you. So being mindful always of looking after yourself whilst helping others out. And the last thing will probably be that you have to have a mindset which requires some attrition, and that these things will not change overnight. And that's okay sometimes. There's nothing wrong with that. You're coming up against some really difficult conversations. So I think the importance of using your voice while also being mindful about yourself and your support systems around you is probably something I want to reinforce, and that all of us have platforms, we have surround ourselves with people that we can continue to kind of escalate that change.
Thank you, Yajur. Josh?
Quite simply, I'd say stop waiting. And that sounds really weird, but just stop waiting around. I'm very guilty of it as well. And it's very easy to sit back and be like, oh, what's called the world's burning, the world's in chaos, or society is this, or oh, that community is this. We seem to homogenize everything and lose the role of the individual in things. If there is something in your local community that you want to change, guess who else is a part of that local community? You. If there's something in society that is unequal or something that is causing people harm and you can't bear to see it, you can do something about that. You may not be able to change the world overnight, but we need to stop negating responsibility. We need to start seeing ourselves as the main character in all of our stories. Because at the moment, I think a lot of us are quite comfortable to sit back and have a cigarette, and I know that cigarette, sorry, that's me. But sit back, have a glass of water and talk with our friends and family about how awful everything is and about how terrible everything is. And then we have our hot chocolate, brush our teeth and go to bed. Then we do the same thing the next day. If you are so frustrated about things and so exhausted with what is going on, and you feel something that's coursing through your veins and all you want to do is scream, know that you have the capacity to be able to change something. Not overnight, but it starts with the individual. It turns into a movement, and together we can change things. That relies on all of us stepping up and stepping out rather than sitting back and relaxing.
Thank you, Joshua. Carlette?
Yes, I think my final thought would be, look, Black people and Asian people, ethnic minorities are the leaders of comorbid and chronic health diseases. And I think that the best way to handle microaggressions, excuse me, is to understand the stress and the trauma that these experiences put on your mind and body, and to further dismiss those experiences as causing more harm to yourself. So to accept and recognize what is reality, and then find ways to cope with it, whether it's either speaking with a professional or exercising or, walking the dog, whatever it is, but to allow yourself to understand that it is real and that it is affecting you. And I think that is the main takeaway, is because microaggressions are so subtle, you spend a lot of your time thinking, was that really racist? Well, yeah, if you think that it was racist, chances are it probably was. And to try to convince yourself that you have a right to feel that the way that you feel, and to express that in healthy ways, and to overcome that. I think that would be my biggest message.
Thank you, Carlette. With that, we'll wrap the session up. I just want to thank all the speakers today. They've not only created awareness of the issues, but they've educated us on how to challenge and overcome certain microaggressions. The lessons we've learned, or I've learned, are the basics of a moral and civil society. Just be respectful, be kind, be considerate of the feelings of colleagues, peers, and friends. Thank you, everybody on the panel. Thank you so much. And I hand it back to Sarah. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Thanks to the attendees as well.
Yeah, I just want to add my thanks as well. I've learned a huge amount this evening, and the questions and discussion have been really, really great as well. So thank you very much. Hopefully this isn't something that we see as sort of isolated within Black History Month, but obviously these are conversations we need to keep having and work that we need to keep doing. Thanks very much, everybody. Good night.